And I think that's all I had to say. So,
well, so given the timing and since we kind of ran out, we're in the beginning / middle here of the third unit. Your final exam is actually not going to be comprehensive. It'll be just based on the Unit 3 that we've covered here. So that it'll just be kind of a final test. It'll be a little bit longer and cover a little bit more material. I think this Unit 3 here is pretty important, so I wanted to get that in, and we're just going to try to cover as much of it as we can today and Wednesday, and then we'll do the exam on that. I'm going to be opening up the quizzes for that today, so you'll be able to take those quizzes to kind of prepare you for the exam as well. I didn't want to do that before the test was over, so didn't have too much to do. Of course, don't forget about your crop project. I've also got a little example of the crop project to post online. And given that you guys were really just did not have time to get together to work on teams, we're just going to have you guys do a individual PowerPoint presentation to post onto a discussion board topic for your crop projects. And I'll kind of lay it out. So for mine, I'll have a paper copy of kind of the eggplant, kind of a Word document. You can turn it in Word or PDF, however you want to. And then I'll also have an example of what we're looking for as a kind of narrated PowerPoint. And I'll send that out to you guys and show you basically how to record your voice over your PowerPoint as well. So you can make a little presentation, present for your final crop project. All right, so I'm going to
what's the PowerPoint do?
that'll be due just kind of, I guess, end of the semester. So it'll be that. When are grades due for you all, Tom?
Monday the 17th at 8 a.m. in the morning.
So we'll basically say that Friday before, so that you'll give me time to grade them, and you guys will still have access to look at everybody else's PowerPoints too. So say Monday the 14th, or sorry, Friday the 14th, be when that is due. Prop projects. Hopefully you guys have already been working on those though. All right, let's get back into chapter 15 here. We're kind of where we left off, talking about chemicals for pest management. And of course, there are all kinds of chemicals that we use for controlling all pests, not just insects. Remember, insecticides are those that are used for controlling insects. And in the U.S., we have a pretty significant system for approval and registration of these pesticides. It's governed through the EPA, but it's also, there's several different agencies that are involved with it. In Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, who you got your private pesticide applicator certification through, is the body that administers it in Virginia. So it governs how pesticides are to be used legally. Remember, the label is the law, right? Big issue with that is residues on food or feed crops. So there is some testing that goes in conjunction with that, and of course there are health issues associated with it. So there are a few different categories of insecticides. We started talking about a little bit about mode of action, but they're also classified by chemistry. So we have inorganic compounds, which these tended to be very toxic, but weren't extremely effective. So there were lots of side effects associated with them, things like arsenic, some sulfur compounds, and the use of these is greatly diminished, although there are some that we still use. some more, kind of modern pesticides are these biorational compounds. And often these are derived from plants. So, for instance, pyrethrum is obtained from the Pyrethrum daisy. Nicotine, of course, derived from tobacco. There's an extract from the neem tree and oil that we use as a biorational pesticide as well. And these are not just insecticides. Also, some of these are also fungicides and bactericides as well. And these are constantly being developed more often. So then we have the synthetic organic chemicals. And the thing with organic here, not certified organic, but
He's on there. He gone. Yep.
All right. Well, let's see if we can get back here. Sorry about that, you all. All right, here we go. You guys able to see that?
Almost. It's still saying that you started screen sharing, but it hadn't popped up yet. No, we got you again.
All right, let's try that again. How about now?
Yep.
All right, there we go.
It's alive.
It's alive. What a monster.
Yes.
Okay, as I was saying there, not organic as in certified organic chemicals, but organic as in these chemicals are based on hydrocarbons. So you think about organic chemistry, it's looking at these long chains of chemicals, looking at these chlorinated hydrocarbons, mostly made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So one of the most famous of these, of course, being DDT, which was a very popular chemical. And as maybe you may know, it was said to be safe. But then later on, they found out that DDT was not safe at all and was leading to the death of lots of different organisms, doing all kinds of ecological damage. So eventually they banned it. And most of the countries around the world, there are a couple of countries where you can still use DDT. Then there's another class known as the organic phosphates that were developed kind of towards the end of World War II. Again, kind of post-Green Revolution, they had all these chemicals that they were developing for warfare, and then they shifted those to be used for agriculture. So the big thing with the chlorinated hydrocarbons and DDT especially was that they were very persistent and remained in these environments for long periods of time. These organic phosphates were better than that. They decomposed more rapidly. And there are many of those that are still available. Some of them have been banned as well, though. Still very toxic. Carbamates are just another class, and they're pretty effective. Many of these are systemic, which means the insect actually has to ingest it in order for it to be useful. Then we got synthetic organic chemicals that were actually kind of synthesized based on a lot of these biorational pesticides that we were looking at, like pyrethroids, kind of based on pyrethrum. And now this class of chemicals is known as pyrethrins. The neonicotinoids, kind of based on the nicotine chemical. And then we have spray oils, and now also microbial insecticides, which are also kind of biorational, except they're based on organisms, usually like soil organisms. Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, is one of the most well known of these. And we've actually had several, crops that we've genetically engineered to actually produce BT inside of the plant, which makes them, basically toxic to any insects. All right, so let's look at the vertebrate pests here. Of course, mammals can be pests, as we know. There aren't very many pesticides out there that are, made for mammals, but they're still very important to look at. What do we do about these? So there's rodenticides out there to take care of things like rats, for instance. And as you know, deer, mice, gophers, rabbits, all kinds of mammals can be awful pests. Birds can be as well. So generally what are used to try to control, or more often to deter these pests, are these non-lethal chemical repellents. And they use scare tactics, explosives, and other animals. We might bring dogs into the pictures. Fencing, of course. Lots of different things that we can do to try to prevent these very damaging mammals. Diseases, on the other hand, are a little bit different. And of course, we have kind of a dichotomy here. Some integrated pest management people look at diseases as basically just any suboptimal plant growth. And sometimes we look at these diseases as being caused by a pathogen, which is really what I think of as a disease, is that it is actually caused by a pathogen. But just that definition, this condition that causes suboptimal plant growth, could be applied to non-living causes as well. So generally I separate these out. I don't include the abiotic issues in the disease category, mostly just because it gets confusing. But just know, for the general definition, it could include both. There are many different abiotic issues that we look at as kind of like pest damage, but the pest that usually causes those are ourselves. We accidentally cause this kind of damage. Of course, environmental issues as well, and we could kind of look at that as being an issue with us as well. We planted it at the wrong time, or we didn't provide some sort of protection for it. A lot of these kind of look like they might have been caused by living things, caused by a pathogen, such as nutrient deficiencies and toxicities. Sometimes these look like diseases. So it's important to be able to diagnose issues with plants and look at it and look at what you've done to the plant, whether it was a disease or an abiotic, a physiological issue. So, of course, all kinds of different plant pathogens out there, including viruses, bacteria, phytoplasmas, other fungal-like organisms, fungi themselves, nematodes, and also other parasitic plants that cause all kinds of problems in our crops. Some of these most common pathogens include things like Rhizoctonia, Pythium, Fusarium. They can infect a broad range of plant species, whereas there are other pathogens that are only target one particular species. So it's important to know what your key pests are, and that's why in that crop project I wanted you to look at the different key pests of each crop. So there's stages of development for each of these pathogens. Stages of pathogenesis: first, you come in contact with a susceptible host, and it may make its way into the plant. That we know as inoculation. Generally, there has to be some sort of wounding, or in some cases, a natural opening in which they can actually inoculate it. And I think of like mushrooms, for instance, if you're trying to grow mushrooms, you inoculate your material with the spore. So it's the same idea with infectious pathogens too. Once that pest has become established within the host, there's a stage between inoculation and when the actual signs appear, and that is known as incubation. And then when it grows and reproduces and you actually start to see the signs and symptoms, then that is known as infection. Those are the three stages of pathogenesis. And of course, we think back to that disease triangle that we talked about last week. You have to have a susceptible host plant as well as the presence of the organism or the propagule of that organism. And of course, you also have to have the environment that allows it to actually infect, incubate, and infect. So here's just an image of this kind of disease cycle and how it happens, and some of the things that we can see versus what we cannot see. Let's talk for a second about signs and symptoms. A sign is actually the physical presence of the organism, usually that you can see, often with the naked eye. Sometimes you have to have some sort of magnification to be able to see it. Symptoms are the actual plant's reaction to the disease. So symptoms can change. Generally, the signs we look at, like, for instance, the fungal hyphae or mycelium of a fungus, or the spores or fruiting bodies of that fungus or bacteria. The symptoms, though, are the plant's response to that. And these are generally detectable. You can see symptoms, but you can't always see the sign. So what are some things that we see? Things like abnormal tissue coloration, as we see in these corn plants here. And again, these can look very similar to deficiencies. It kind of looks like a phosphorus deficiency there in these corn plants. But it could also be a disease. So it's important to know what you might be faced with. Wilting can be a big issue. It can cause wilt of plants, and generally that's because it's blocked some part of water uptake or transport through the plant. You got tissue death itself, whether that is just a lesion that appears or death of the entire plant, which we often refer to as blight. You have cankers appearing as well, either like a large growth or an area of sunken tissue. Defoliation tends to happen often with diseases, where it can lose its leaves or sometimes also drop fruit. Many different things can cause defoliation. We can also have sort of cancerous growths, often looking at things like galls as a result from diseases, or dwarfing. So kind of the opposites there. We can also have a replacement of the actual natural tissue of the plant with the infectious organism itself. As pictured here, we've got corn smut, which is a fungus that infects the actual ears of corn, and that is the fruiting body of the fungus that we see. So that's a sign that we see there, although we might also see some symptoms in the plant as well. Interesting to note that in this case, the fungus corn smut is actually a delicacy in Mexico. I mean, it's like an edible mushroom. Viruses are a totally different beast here. They are just single-celled. I mean, well, actually, it's not really like a cell at all. It's just basically a packet of DNA. There is no pesticide out there that can control a virus. The first virus that was ever recorded was tobacco mosaic virus, and we didn't even know that viruses were out there before TMB occurred, and that causes this really interesting modeling in all kinds of different plants in the Solanaceae family, including tobacco, tomatoes, peppers, etc. And that's an interesting one because this can be carried by people. If you use tobacco and you touch these plants, then you can actually be the vector, carrying the virus and moving it between plants. And also, just note, I know we already talked about this before, but organisms that transmit the pathogens themselves are called the vectors. Now, viruses are obligate parasites, so they have to have a living host in order to be able to grow and multiply. And generally, those hosts have to be of the same family. They generally are very specific to either a family of plants or sometimes just species. Once it's infected, really you should just be destroying that plant to prevent spread of that virus. And in the destruction of it, you have to be very careful to sterilize anything that you've used to destroy the plant. Bacteria, other infectious organisms are microscopic, so we generally don't see bacteria unless we're looking under a microscope. We can see signs of bacteria in extremely large colonies in many cases. They multiply at extremely alarming rates and can cause some major, very quick plant decline, especially if you have the right environmental conditions, which tend to be warm and moist. Fungi and the fungal-like organisms, known as flows, cause more plant diseases than any other group of plant pathogens. There are over 8,000 species that are known to cause diseases in plants. So fungi are also very, very bad. And generally, they absorb these nutrients from plants through these thread-like filaments known as hyphae, which is basically, it's kind of like the root of the fungus in a way. When you have lots of hyphae together, you know that as mycelium. This is a very common fungus pictured here, botrytis, and that's something that we often refer to as a mold, but most molds are actually fungi or fungal-like organisms, and this is a big problem in post-harvest fruits. Can be problems in pre-harvest as well, but generally, I'm sure everyone's seen this white fuzz on some soft fruits that you've gotten from the supermarket at some point. There's nothing you can do at that point. Once it's started to infect it, what are you going to do? Spray a fungicide on this fruit that you're getting ready to eat? So there's this whole issue of trying to remove the residues of pesticides from plants and how you have to be able to flush that or let the pesticide decompose before it's harvested in many cases in order to prevent problems in people. Nematodes are very simple microscopic animals, but they are multicellular, and they appear to look like worms, but really you can only see them under a microscope. So they can also cause problems, and most of them are actually not pathogens. Many of them actually do good things. So there are predatory nematodes out there. You can control some of your pest nematodes through these predatory nematodes that can attack fungi and bacteria as well. One of these nematodes was actually the first organism to actually have its genome completely sequenced. And so it's a really well understood organism because of that. There are many species of nematodes out there that are damaging to crops, and they can be feeders of foliage, but most often they are root nematodes, and they actually cause these galls to form on the roots of plants. They can be really difficult to diagnose because you have to look at the roots in order to see the signs of the organism itself. although you'll see the symptoms on the above ground parts. So a little bit about diagnosis. One of the first steps, one of the first things you really need to look at is just defining the problem, actually describing what the problem is. You have to know the host plant, know it well, and be familiar with what it's supposed to look like, its normal state, as well as being able to describe the altered state. Then you also want to look at the entire plant community, the crops. What does it look like in the row? Is it just on a few plants? Is it on all the plants? Often if it's on many different plants, it could be, or all the plants, it's usually more of an abiotic issue than a disease. So again, look for the patterns. Is it a single plant? Is it multiple plants? Is it restricted to a particular area or a single species? Are the symptoms randomly distributed, or are they very distinctly distributed? Often random distributions are more from organisms, whereas uniform distributions are more abiotic. And then look at how that damage is developing over time. Did it occur suddenly, or is it spreading, or is it staying in the same spot? Generally, if you have progressive development, then it's more often living organisms. And if it's not spreading that much, then generally it's abiotic. So act like a detective or a journalist and ask a lot of different questions and gather as much information as possible to determine the causes of the plant damage. Look at the particular cultivar, the variety itself. Think about your cultural practices. Have you applied any fertilizers or pesticides? Also think about the environmental issues. What's your irrigation like? Has there been natural rainfall? Has there been a cold spell? Also know a little bit about the history of the site or the stand of the crop itself. So really monitoring and scouting in these cases is extremely important. And in many cases, you might need to enlist the services of a disease diagnosis laboratory. We've got those at Virginia Tech and Virginia State University. All right, so that's the end of the pest management. I know we don't have very much time here, but I do want to try to start a little bit here on chapter 16. Getting into just some general considerations for production and harvest. So let me try to share my screen again here. All right. So we're talking about crop production. There are many principles and practices that are similar or the same for a lot of all of our commodified crops. And we're going to look at these kind of individually. But first and most important consideration is site analysis. And always when you're planning for production, you're looking at an area to grow. One of the big things you want to look at is future expansion. You might start small, but you might expand. So planning to expand is important. Of course, water supply is extremely important. And in that, we don't want to just think about the quantity, but the quality of water. I don't know if you all have this issue, but one of our main issues here is that a lot of our water is filtered through limestone. So it's hard water. And because of that, it can clog irrigation emitters. It can also just lead to negative, almost increase in soluble salts in a lot of crops as well. Look at the physical features of the land. The topography is extremely important. What does it look like? Could it be subject to flooding? Is there actual arable, plowable land? Along with topography, we'll have a lot of microclimatic features as well. Warm zones and cold zones that could be formed by the changes in elevation over a site, or just different geographic and architectural features. Of course, we talked quite a bit about soil. Soil type is extremely important, something that you really cannot change. You might be able to change the organic matter content of the soil, but you can't actually change the soil's texture. So looking at the soil type is an important factor in site analysis and what crops you'll actually be able to grow. Thinking of the climate, the overall climate as well as the microclimate is going to govern, again, what crops you're able to grow, what your growing season looks like. In some cases, you might have to provide protection from heat or sun. In other cases, you might have to provide protection from cold. Think about annual drought and flood patterns. What is the dry season? What is the wet season? Could you have a nearby waterway that could cause flooding? And what are the seasons in which these things happen? So, generally for the mid-Atlantic, we have a pretty varied climate in that we don't have like established annual drought and flood cycles like we do in other parts of the country and other parts of the world, where there are very often dry and then monsoon seasons. Think about the prevailing wind and also the potential for hail. And of course, the possibility of extreme weather events, which seems like it tends to shift a little bit. We're always going to have issues with hurricanes in our area in terms of precipitation coming off of them. We might not have hurricane damage itself, but we can have damage associated with hurricanes. So think about the possibility of extreme weather. Look at the whole picture. You also have to really look at the economic and social factors. And these are sometimes some of the hardest factors to really be able to get a good grasp on. One of the biggest costs for any operation is just land itself. Along with that, the availability of labor can be a big issue. And we're not just talking about any labor, but a trained labor pool and reliable labor. Generally, labor is one of the highest costs of any business, but especially agricultural businesses. They usually say about a third of business costs is in labor. Think about transportation as well. Sure, you might be able to produce a crop just fine, but what do you do when you produce it? How are you going to sell it? How are you going to move it to a place to be sold? Are you going to do wholesale or retail? If you're doing retail and direct selling it to a customer, then that's another thing that you need to look at. You need to have space for your customers to be able to come. You need to be accessible for your customers. So looking at some of the traditional, conventional production systems, and they say here in the book, they're talking about until the late 1900s, in developed countries, it relied heavily on high resource inputs. Well, it still does in most cases in these developed countries, parts of the world. We do make heavy use of fossil fuels. And one of the big things that I want to point out here, why we use fossil fuels, well, it's pretty simple. It makes our jobs easier. There was a scientist that basically said that 1 gallon of fossil fuel could be equivalent of up to 100 hours of human labor. So knowing that and how important that is, it really makes sense as to why we use these expensive and sometimes costly, not just in the dollar figure, but the environmental costs associated with it. So how do you value a crop? What do you price it as? Of course, some of that is going to be based on just the pricing of your competition. What is the fair market value? In commodities, for instance, you have to go by that pricing. It's determined by the market itself. But in some retail cases and even some wholesale cases, if you're able to differentiate your product enough, then you might be able to command your own price. In any case, the value of the crop is determined, at least in part, by the inputs that are used to produce the crop. So for instance, for a lot of our commodity crops, the use of fungicides is cost prohibitive. So because in many of these cases, these subsidized crops are extremely slim margins. You have to have tons and tons of acreage in order to be able to make a profit. So agriculture has changed, and it's becoming more ecologically sound. And this is just a photograph of looking at the above from a farm, looking at the preservation and the restoration, even the creation of wetlands because of their importance for other ecosystems, and incorporating these into conventional production. Organic growing systems basically, are trying to reduce or remove the dependence of some non-renewable resources, at least initially anyway, especially on synthetic chemicals. So generally, organic growing tries to be ecologically based, but today, of course, we have industrialized organic agriculture too, and it's not always ecologically based. Of course, in order to become organic, it has to be certified by USDA or the third party. And in this case, there are very strict requirements set in order to be able to meet that certification. And there are many growers out there that might use organic practices but do not actually become certified due to the record keeping and just the cost of it. It costs a lot to become certified. So in that case, they cannot label their products as organic, but they can describe them as being organically produced. Let's talk for just a minute about sustainability, the idea of it itself, and how we define it, looking at meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And really, we look at three areas of sustainability. We look at economic sustainability, environmental, and social sustainability. For a long time, crops were, one of the oldest production systems was slash and burn agriculture, where basically took an area of forest, cut it, and burned the trees in order to obtain nutrients, get those into the soil. And then they were left fallow for long periods of time. Of course, there's some environmental issues associated with slash and burn. It's still practiced in some parts of the world. The USDA has actually recently created, I say recently, but it was back in the 90s, a branch of kind of sustainable research. They call it the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. And there are actually lots of grants available to try to create some more sustainable agricultural practices. Might be something you guys be interested in looking at some point. In some cases, they're trying to make small farms just more profitable, developing more profitable sources of income, and promoting environmental stewardship, including protecting environment and improving soil quality, reducing the dependence of non-renewable resources, and then minimizing ecological effects, as well as just promoting stable and prosperous farm families and communities. Again, kind of incorporating all of those areas of sustainability, the social, economic, and environmental issues. Last thing here, just want to look at these 8 key elements of sustainability. Look at sustainable crop production, ecosystem management and protection, resource conservation, energy efficiency, integrated waste management, fair labor practices, community benefits, product quality, and of course, safety and purity of products. And looking at these practices that build and maintain healthy agro ecosystems while kind of still managing pests, but using more biological, mechanical, and cultural methods, looking at the integrated pest management rather than just the use of chemicals, and trying to minimize fossil fuel inputs where possible. All right, so we're out of time here, so I'm gonna stop there. We'll continue with chapter 16 on Wednesday. We'll kind of seal that up. Go ahead. Remember, finish your test by tonight, 11:59 p.m. And then we'll get into opening up the quizzes for chapters in Unit 3. Again, our final exam is just going to be based on Unit 3. So it'll just be like a regular test. Anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns?
I'll just remind people to do your lab trip reports too if you haven't done them.
Yeah, which by the way, I've graded all of those lab reports up until now. So, Tom, what are we gonna do for that last lab? That
the pesticide.
Yeah.
Where the excuse me, the extension agents are supposed to send us their test scores, and when we get them, I'll put them in.
Okay. Sounds good.
Wait, so we don't have to, are we writing a report for that, for the pesticides?
No, you do not have to write a report.
Okay.
You're taking the test is kind of you indicating that you paid attention and learned things.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Anything else?
We will see you on Wednesday.
Okay. Bye.